Yeah, I'm going to do my purple.
All right, guys, get started. New chapter of chapter 19, blood vessels. We've been talking about blood vessels since we talked about the heart, because a lot of the great vessels attached to the heart are the same vessels we talked about here: arteries, capillaries, and veins. The arteries are the distributors. We'll talk about the physical properties of them. The capillaries are an exchange medium, and the veins return blood to the heart. So nothing new there. Now this slide, my bullet points up there, it shows the entire circulatory system. And we start to see that there are some differences between some of the larger arteries, which are called elastic arteries, and as they branch out, they become muscular arteries. The smallest arteries are arterioles. There's precapillary sphincters. There's the capillary bed shown there. So we see that there are a variety of arteries. But one new thing, I don't know if I mentioned the anastomosis shown here. You can bypass capillary beds by going straight from arteries to veins. Arterial venous anastomosis. You go straight from artery to vein, and you bypass the capillaries. You cannot supply blood to all the capillaries all the time, as we'll see. So you kind of bypass them when you're not using them. The other thing that's new are the lymphatics shown here. You have fluid exchange at the capillary beds, but not all of the fluids that are filtered out are absorbed back in. So there's kind of a net accumulation of fluids in the interstitium, and it's the job of the lymphatic capillaries to collect excess fluids of capillary exchange and return it to the blood. So the lymphatics are a part of the circulatory system. Lymphatic capillaries collect the excess fluids from blood capillaries and return it to venous blood. And that's basically why it's a part of circulation. It contributes to blood volume. So this picture shows the complete picture of circulation: arteries, capillaries, veins, and lymphatics. In addition to returning that blood to the veins, there's also along the way lymph nodes, which will sterilize the blood, or the lymph, because white blood cells are in the lymphocytes. So one thing you should know, I have a whole chapter on lymphatics, but these excess fluids, you call it lymph. Lymph is fluid. Again, that fluid is from the capillaries, from the blood capillaries. So don't confuse the blood capillaries, an exchange medium, for lymph capillaries. That's one thing I want to point out, and I'm going to move on from this slide. And now I want to focus on just the differences between two major categories of blood vessels, arteries and veins. Usually they're seen together, but blood is flowing in opposite direction because the blood is distributed with arteries, but veins are the collection and return system. So if you look at this cross-sectional view, which is unlabeled, I mean, if you had to guess, which is the artery,
Small.
the big one or the small one?
Small.
Okay, some of you are guessing the small one, and you would be correct. That's the vein, that's the artery. So just by appearance, they look different. Now, don't just look at the entire diameter of the whole thing. Look at the thickness of the vessel wall. Which is a thicker vessel wall?
Arteries.
The arteries do, and I say it's thick walled right there too. So there are some structural differences. Now, the biggest thing I want to go through first is that first bullet point. In veins, we observe low pressures. In arteries, we observe high pressures. So the concept at the top there that I want to talk about first for arteries and veins is that pressure is a function of volume capacitance of the vessel. I mean, arteries and veins are both blood vessels, but they do differ in pressure. Arteries are your distributors. Whereas veins, collection and return. Return it to the right side of the heart. Now for the arteries, we observe high pressures. Put a number to it, 120/80. We always know that it's units of millimeters of mercury in the medical sciences. If you want to put that as one number, the average is 93. Mean arterial pressure, millimeters of mercury. Very high. Very high. When we get to veins, the pressures are very low. Maybe there's no high-low thing in veins as there is in arteries. There's no pressure peak and pressure drop-off. But in veins, maybe 1 to 3 millimeters of mercury, if that, and some of the larger ones, it was very low. So the blood flow in veins is probably due to something besides the pressure that we observe in them. Well, one thing I want to say about arteries is, if you just look at them, they're thick-walled. They're basically described as a stiff vessel with a small capacitance. So, I mean, if you look at the cross-sectional area, it's kind of smaller. I'll draw it lengthwise. The thing is, okay, capacitance means it doesn't hold a lot. Capacitance is holding capacity. That's it. Don't be frightened by that word. It's just how much the vessel holds. A vessel holds something, in this case, blood. It's rather stiff. Doesn't give a lot, doesn't hold a lot. So this small volume of blood, it's all right, small volume in here. This small volume is large for its capacitance. So think about that. Doesn't hold a lot of blood, but what it does hold, it's full. It can't hold any more. So because of that, we observe high pressures as a result. We observe high pressures as a result. High pressure. I'm just writing high pressure in big words, you know, just to symbolize. You got like small volume, but it's really full. The artery is at full capacity there. So that's why we observe high pressures. Okay. So the other thing about veins, well, they are kind of the opposite. Veins are a compliant vessel with a large capacitance. A compliant vessel with a large capacitance. And so what they do is I'll draw a big vessel, right? They carry a large volume of blood. Now, an average adult, maybe about 5 liters of blood circulates, and most of that is in the veins. So, large volume. However, this large volume of blood is small for its capacitance, so that's why we observe low pressures. This large volume is small for its capacitance. We observe low pressures as a result. Low pressure in the smallest letters to symbolize a small, low pressure, I guess. So that's one of the main differences. Know the relationship between CVP. To put this in mathematical form, C equals V over P. What volume of blood do veins have? Large or small? Large. Picture a big number in the numerator. What pressures do we observe? Low pressures. What happens when you divide a large number by a small number? You get a large number, right? They have large capacitance. They hold a lot. And it's the opposite for arteries. They hold a small volume, small number. We observe high pressures in them. Divide a small number by a big number. You get a small number. They have a small capacitance. So, small capacitance, large capacitance. Arteries hold about 15% of all the blood that's circulating. Okay. Veins, it's something like 60%-ish. Around there. So let's move on from this point. I have some other points here. All of that just describes the first bullet point here, high pressures, low pressures. This is a physiology class, so I have to explain in detail. Know the CVP. Okay, well, the other thing I have there, the second or the third point, yeah, second point, where it says have sheets of elastic fibers. I have that listed under arteries. That's a very important property for the arteries. Let's think about, since you had the sheep heart in your hand, you saw the aorta. The aorta is considered an elastic artery. The arteries closest to the heart have many sheets of elastic fibers. Arteries closest to the heart have many sheets of elastic fibers. So, I mean, just think what elastic is. You can stretch it, and it can recoil. So in systole, when it receives the cardiac output, the stroke volume, it can expand to receive the cardiac output during systole. But then what happens during diastole? They recoil. You stretch, recoil. And that's very important. So during diastole, we see this, what I have on the slide, this elastic recoil. That's why we observe the 120/80, right? The 120 and the 80 is the elastic recoil, that pressure that's maintained while the heart's in diastole. The heart's not providing any pressure. It's resting. It's refilling for the next cardiac cycle. Yes, that's the importance of the sheets of elastic fibers. One point I have for veins that's not for arteries is these venous valves. Prevent backflow. Backwards flow of blood. Now, the arteries, technically, there is a valve. The aortic valve is one, but that's it. After you get past the aortic valve, there are no valves throughout the length of arteries. Now, veins have these valves throughout their length. They're like semilunar valves, okay? Like those SL valves. You need them because of the low pressures, so that you don't always have this backwards flow in the veins. The valve will close and it'll stop, so that's important. I already mentioned how the veins are thin-walled. I describe them as floppy and squishy, and arteries are thick-walled. I mean, that really helps me as like when I'm dissecting cadavers and I see them next to each other. I can tell what's what. First, by the coloration. The veins are usually more kind of dark grayish, I guess. It's hard to describe the color, it's very odd. Arteries are more whitish. And I can tell a stiff tube from a floppy tube. It's easy for me to tell just by looking at it. Students don't know, they're just like, they're guessing. But if you've seen them enough times, it doesn't take very long, okay, for you to tell an artery or a vein. Maybe you're in the surgery room or, on a cadaver. They look the same wherever you go. They just don't look like in the books. They're not blue and red, okay? I know that's what we train you to think about them, but they don't look like that. Well, one thing I will put, the thick-walled nature of the arteries is usually due, they have a more pronounced tunica media. So I didn't teach the tunics yet, let's just note it for now. They have a very thick, I'll just put TM, which stands for tunica media. I'm going to define the tunics later. For the veins, they have a thick TA, tunica adventitia, the outermost layer. So when I describe the tunics, that'll make more sense, just noted for now. One thing about arteries, I say that they're very deep for protection. There are very few places you can feel your pulse. You could feel it on your wrist, your radial artery, your carotid, your femoral, maybe the top of your foot. It's called the dorsalis pedis artery. There's a few other locations, but there's not too many. I can see my veins, right? All my arms and my legs. And there's no arteries that run with those veins. They're superficial veins with no accompanying arteries, and you can shunt blood flow to the superficial system on a hot day to shunt more, give off more heat, dissipate heat to the ambient air, as we say. So they control body temperature a little better. All right, so I already mentioned small and large capacitance. I want to move away from the compare, contrast list, but let's look at a picture of an artery and vein now. There's a muscular artery and a large vein. You can see the difference. The veins are larger, and it kind of answers the question I have at the top. Why are veins so much more higher compliance? Why do they have that large capacitance? Think about the geometry. Well, both arteries are kind of squished, but if you're large and also flattened, don't you have room to like expand by becoming more round? And what we observe is you can blow these things up and you won't even see very large changes in pressure. So the capacitance of these things are very large due to their shape or geometry. They're usually flattened and they have the ability to expand. So a lot of times veins are called your, or right here, your blood reservoir. These are your quote unquote capacitance vessels. Quote unquote, or blood reservoir. Reservoir. At any given time, most of the blood is on the venous side. Okay, this is the typical pressure figure. What they're doing is they're showing you the circulation of the vasculature, starting with the arteries that are closest to the heart, aorta, then arteries, arterioles, which are the smallest arteries, then the capillaries, the venules, and then the largest veins back to the right heart. Okay? And the things you're supposed to observe, let me teach you the calculations first. What I did was I made a table to kind of ballpark the numbers. The first thing to do, let's calculate the mean arterial pressure. I always just abbreviate it MAP. Mean arterial pressure. The equation is the diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 pulse pressure. If you have to, write it out in your notes so you don't go back and look. What's DBP? Diastolic blood pressure. What's MAP? Why did I write MAP? MAP of what? Mean arterial pressure. So, you know, if you have to write it out. But, and we're just taking an average. You say, I know how to take the mean. Isn't it just 100 if it's 120 over 80? If it's just by math, yes. But in the heart, in the cardiac cycle, can't do that. What's the top number for? Systole or diastole? Systole. And the bottom number is diastole. How long is the cardiac cycle? 0.8. Now, how much of that 0.8 were you in diastole? 0.5. So you spend more time in diastole. So you can't just divide, take a true average. You have to consider you spend more time in diastole. So that's why this equation works better. And there are others. You can Google it. That's the one I always give. And so if it's our classic 120 over 80, where am I getting that? Boom, boom. What's this stuff in there? You should be able to know that. Student of physiology, what is it? That's you. That's your, see this green line there? That's it. Imagine that just squished. Green line. That's the arterial pressure, right? From the aorta. Just squish that. And that's what they put in that slide there. Yeah, that. as is the cardiac cycles for the artery score. So high, low. So let's do it. Our diastolic blood pressure is 80. Now, pulse pressure can be calculated. You just subtract the systolic from the diastolic. So it's 40. I'm just going to do it in my head. You know, given our 120 over 80. So if you just kind of do it, I'm going to round that to around 13. So it's about 93. So it's not quite 100, right? It's closer to the diastolic because you spend more time in diastole. So that's one thing you should do. So I told you how to calculate pulse pressure. If you forget, pulse pressure is always going to be the systolic blood pressure minus diastolic blood pressure. So in our case, about 40. And that's what you feel when you feel a pulse. When you palpate the pulse, that's what you're feeling. You're feeling the difference between that pressure rise and the pressure drop. Okay. Now the pulse pressure disappears when you get down to the smallest arteries. Notice that? So no pulse pressure from arterioles on down. I'm going to note that. No pulse pressure from arterioles on. Oops. I'm not saying there's no pressure. I'm saying there's no pulse pressure. There's pressure. It does drop, but there's still pressure. You know, 45, 20, it gets really low. I mean, I just eyeballed it. Okay. But that's pretty interesting. By the time you get to the capillaries, this is the most important part. This is where you have the oxygen-rich blood being delivered to the capillaries for the gas exchange. The pressure drops to around like 40 to 20. And by the time you get to the veins, they hold the most blood, but there's hardly any pressure in them. That's what we're observing. Okay. So by the time you get all the way to capillaries, certainly past capillaries, the heart is not providing any pressure for these structures. The pumping of the heart is for the arteries that are closest to it. Okay. All right, here's a picture showing why veins are called your capacitance vessels or your blood reservoir. Just look at the pie chart. Most of the blood is in the veins. So, the veins are a blood reservoir. Now, we already noted that, but I would have noted right next to the answer to my next question. I kind of already answered this question. How are large arteries able to maintain the diastolic blood pressure while the LV is in diastole? Because when the heart's in diastole, it's not providing any pressure. However, pressure in the aorta remains elevated. It's slowly declining, but it remains significantly above like almost zero. Again, that's the pressure reservoir I talked about before. So arteries have a pressure reservoir function because of their elasticity. That's a picture of it here. I want to say elastic arteries have a pressure reservoir when they expand. because when you expand, then you can recoil. And that's the reservoir. You're using that. The pressure stored when you expand in systole, shown on the left. You expand and blood opens the valve and you push blood forward. Now, when the heart muscle relaxes, blood starts to flow backwards, you close the valve, makes the dup sound, but the elastic recoil is pushing the blood forward while the heart's in diastole. So that's the pressure reservoir, not to be confused with the blood reservoir of the veins. Okay, different concepts. All right, so now I want to get into the structure of the largest arteries and veins, the ones that have all three tunics. I usually use this figure to teach that because, well, not only does it show you the largest arteries and veins, it shows you how they're connected through capillary beds. So I have the 3, 2, 1, 2, 3. The largest vessels have all three tunics, all three layers. And maybe it gets down to 2 and then 1. Okay, then you build it back up. But let's just kind of talk about all three tunics so you know the relative makeup of all the tunics. The innermost tunic that touches the blood, that surrounds the lumen, whether blood is flowing one way or the other. I kind of like that. Remember, arteries and veins are usually shown together and blood is flowing in opposite direction. But the innermost tunic surrounding the lumen of the blood vessel is called the tunica intima. It's intimate with the blood. Also called tunica interna, TI for short. The innermost layer of this tunic is something called the endothelium. It's a simple squamous epithelial tissue. That's all it is. It's basically the same thing as the endocardium, the innermost layer of the heart wall. Okay, well, so if I draw the lumen is the space where blood flows. And then if I draw like a flat layer of cells lining it, that's my endothelium. So each of these little humps is a flat cell, flat squamous cell with a nucleus. Those cells are surrounded by like a connective tissue layer called the subendothelial layer. It's pretty much loose connective tissue. It's like a basement membrane around the endothelium. It's just loose CT. Surrounds there. Now surrounding that in arteries and maybe veins is our first layer of elastic tissue. It's called the internal elastic lamina. Internal elastic lamina. They call it internal elastic membrane. I tend to call it internal elastic lamina, or the IEL for short. I'll draw it as kind of a squiggly line here. Because it is like elastic waistband. It's stretchy. All that is part of the TI. The next tunic is the TM. It's the muscle layer. of the tunica media, the muscle layer, the primary cell is the smooth muscle cells, sometimes called vascular smooth muscle cells. You have many layers of vascular smooth muscle sometimes abbreviated VSMCs or SMCs. So if I ever use those abbreviations, you know where I'm coming from. Now these are spindle-shaped cells. They're arranged in a circle. So let's kind of like take a step back. I drew it on the board, but remember, look at the picture here. So it goes boom, innermost layer, endothelium, subendothelial layer. They drew the internal elastic lamina like Swiss cheese. It's okay. Doesn't look like that to me on the slide, but usually when I see it on histology slides, whenever I see black, dark fibers, it's elastic fibers. Okay. Well, anyways, then tunica media. See how there's many layers there? And you can see how they're arranged in a circle. They're kind of like spindle shaped. So when you cut them, they cut, well, you can't see from there, but let me just kind of draw it out. A smooth muscle cell looks like that, with a cyclops eyeball. Well, that's the nucleus. Solitary nuke right in the middle. When it contracts, it kind of bulges. So you see it shortens. Now it's smooth in appearance, it's not striated, but it does have those contractile proteins that generate tension. So when this is arranged in a circle, it can constrict the vessel. So I'm not going to draw those all the way around. I'll just kind of draw like many red lines to symbolize many layers of vascular smooth muscle. But they have innervation. We call it sympathetic tone. If you increase the sympathetic tone on this layer, you cause a vasoconstriction. I mean, all the cells are kind of like contracting, and when you're arranged in a circle, you impinge upon the lumen and you increase the resistance to blood flowing. That's a very important physiology concept I'll mention here. The other thing you see besides the smooth muscles are, you see varying amounts of elastic tissue in the TM. The same elastic tissue as the IEL, which I use this purplish color, but I'll use a black color so you can see it better against the red. Squiggly black lines represent elastic tissue. And that's the TM. The outermost layer in large vessels is the TA, the tunica adventitia. They use the term Tunica Externa. That's fine. I tend to call it Tunica adventitia. So TA for short. If you want to go with Tunica Externa, go ahead. That's totally acceptable. This is your outer coat. It provides a tough, collagenous outer coat for the blood vessels. So that when they're in the body parts, they're not like loose computer cables. They're anchored to neighboring tissues and organs quite well. You have to dissect them apart. The tunica adventitia is primarily collagenous. You may see very tiny vessels within this layer. They're called the basal vasorum, which means vessels of the vessel. Maybe some of the inner layers of cells in the vessel wall can have some nutrition from the blood that's flowing through it, but in the outermost layers, it's too far away from the blood. So let me use green to illustrate the collagenous connective tissue. Many layers of collagen. And within this tunic, you may find small arteries and veins, the basal vasorum. I'll just draw small arteries. And I'll draw some small veins to symbolize the basal vasorum. They do show the Tunica Externa here. I didn't present it, it's okay. I usually just mostly show the tunica intima with its internal elastic lamina, but just note, you may see internal elastic lamina, external elastic lamina in some of the largest blood vessels there. Now the one thing that I don't include in terms of cell, the relative makeup of the tunics is the venous valve, excuse me, it's in there. I did mention those earlier though. All right, the arteries, I want to start by showing you this graphic that shows the relative makeup of the different blood vessels of the tunics. And so I kind of like this figure because it shows you, I guess, a slice of the tube, so to speak, of the blood vessel we're talking about. It's going to show you the relative makeup of each tunic. And it gives you some little baseball card facts, right? The diameter, right? How thick is that whole thing? But then also, how's the thickness of just the vessel wall? Okay. And so the largest arteries right after the heart are the elastic arteries. So I'll erase this. I mean, the largest artery of all the arteries is the aorta, about 2.5 centimeters. I usually call this arterial tree. Elastic arteries. Sometimes these elastic arteries, the largest ones closest to the heart, are also called conducting arteries, because they conduct blood to large regions of the body, to major regions of the body. So call it elastic or conducting arteries. A good example is left common carotid artery. That's going to conduct blood to the entire head and neck on the left side. You can see the diameter here, 1.5 centimeters on average. So obviously you can see that with the naked eye, no need for a microscope. We have all three layers, all three tunics. I'll just put a 3, and you should know that that means it has TA, TM, as well as TI. They're all there. Okay. So the hallmark is, if you can look at the elastic tissue content of the elastic arteries compared to the other ones, proportionally, these have the most elastic tissue. That's all I'll say. That's the key feature, right? I mean, they have everything. But the key distinguishing feature, they have the most elastic tissue that provides that elastic recall I've been mentioning today. Then as arteries branch out, they get smaller and smaller. And the smaller arteries, you call the muscular arteries. They have about a 6 millimeter diameter. That's easy to see with the naked eye as well. Sometimes they're called distributing arteries. Because they distribute blood within a region. For example, the brachial artery, that will distribute blood within the upper limb. Okay. So these muscles have, these muscular arteries have proportionally the most smooth muscle. I'll just say most SMCs. Okay, then you branch smaller and smaller and smaller, and the smallest arteries right before the capillaries are the arterioles, sometimes called your resistance vessels. The arterioles are called your resistance vessels. Remember those pre-capillary sphincters? Well, you can restrict blood flow or increase resistance to blood flow. Here's a picture of them. At the top, the precapillary sphincters are open, so blood can perfuse this capillary bed. And when they close, you force it through this meta-arterial flow-through channel. Okay? But you're also increasing resistance for blood to flow through the whole capillary bed too. So think of it this way. Big tube, and you have the smallest arterial. If you have a really strong sympathetic signal and you vasoconstrict, I'll put VC, vasoconstrict. It's difficult for blood to flow through there if this is the arterial. So blood tends to stay in the large arteries because your resistance vessels are, clamping down with those precapillary sphincters. That maintains systemic blood pressure. So vasoconstriction increases BP. Okay, more on that later. I just wanted to give you a quick view of why the arterioles are called your resistance vessels. In terms of their structure, we're down to 2 layers. A TM, TI, no TA. So, elastic arteries and muscular arteries got all 3 layers. Arterioles down to 2. TI, they have a TM, but no tunica adventitia. So, what's the outermost layer for arterioles? Which coat? Which tunic? T, M. What do you got? What is TI? Tunica intima, tunica media, but what don't you have? Tunica adventitia, no tunica externa. So what's your outermost layer? TM. So if I say, if I point to this and say identify cell, what are you going to put for the answer? Smooth muscle cell. That's what they're showing you there. So TM is the outermost layer. let's look at that. Let's look at some histology pictures of these different kinds of blood vessels. Well, this is heart. This is where it all starts. The heart pumps blood. You must pump blood into the arteries, but it starts with the cardiac muscle, and you may have to identify intercalated discs. Okay, any dark bar, like for example, that is intercalated disc. There's a nice sharp-looking one right there. The other ones, the first arteries after the heart are the elastic arteries. So the diameter is huge. Okay, I point to where the TI is. Technically you can't see it. This big wall of black and red, that's TM. So the black fibers are the elastic fibers. All the slivers of red are what kind of cells? Smooth muscle cells. High elastic content. There's the TA. That's what collagen fibers look like. The vasovasorum, I point to it there, but I blow it up here. Small vessels of the vessel. The next artery, the muscular artery shown here. The muscular arteries, the TM is more pink, whereas in the elastic artery, the TM is more black due to the high elastic content. So the three layers, TI, TM, TA. Okay, the tunica intima, tunica media, tunica adventitia. So this black squiggly line, which is part of the tunica intima, is the internal elastic lamina. So notice the pinkish color, that's all smooth muscle, but there's kind of strands of black. There's still some elastic tissue in there. And that's the appearance of the TA. Okay. This slide is a different stain, but you can still identify the three layers. TI, TM, TA. This wide expanse is the lumen, and those black staining cells are the red blood cells. That is a muscular artery. The smallest arteries are the arterioles. I know you have them in the spleen, so I just kind of look for the white pulp, and that's where you have these arterioles. We're down to two layers, right? TI, TM, no TA. And here I kind of point to them. To be technical, if you have one or two layers of smooth muscle in the tunica media, you're classified arterial. Let's do capillaries when we get back from break. Go ahead and take a 15-minute break.